to Geared for Growth. I'm your host, Mike Mortlock from MCG Quantity Surveyors. Today we're talking everything auctions, specifically creating a winning formula for bidding at auction. We've got the fabulous Matt Chamberlain from Chamberlain Brown, who's going to walk us through his tips and tricks on how to make sure that you have a great strategy for bidding at auction for a property that you're interested in. We talk about everything prior to the auction, from your due diligence to your comparable sales to the game day nerves of auction morning, everything that you need to do on auction day when it comes to strategy and bidding increments and body language, then to what to actually do and what your options are if the property is passed in or hasn't met the owner's expectations on the day. It's an awesome insight into the mind of a buyer's agent and gives some great tips for creating a strategy yourself to make sure you're securing the property, not overpaying, or getting that property as economically as you can. I'm sure you'll enjoy this one. Here's Matt. Matt Chamberlain, thanks for joining me on Geared for Growth.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I've got a really exciting topic for people, and I think a lot of people will come across in their property investing career if they purchase long enough. We're talking about the auction strategies. So strategies to make sure that you're going to have a successful auction if you are buying a property that's going that way. And that sort of begs the question, how prevalent is auction as a method of sale in Australia? You know, it's got a lot of press where you see the auctioneers in Sydney. It's a big branding exercise for the agency, but for your property investors that are maybe buying typically around that sort of $500,000 price point, will we see auctions quite a lot?
Great little ending to that question, because if we're talking about clients home buyers, investors that are looking, let's say in the mid 500,000s to 800,000s, let's say. Unfortunately, these days, a good investment property tends to be a little bit more beyond 500, but it's probably less prevalent for lower value properties than it would be for higher value properties. And then also, depending on where you're purchasing in Australia as well, you'll often hear a headline that Melbourne is the auction capital of the world when it comes to property, and it's very true. Sydney close behind that, but then if you were to go up to, say, Brisbane or over to WA, there's not as many properties that actually sell by auction. And in those markets specifically, you'd be looking at properties that tend to be skewed towards the higher value properties. So in saying that, though, where I'm from in Newcastle, I would say, depending on what's going on in the market, you might actually see upwards of 30, 40, 50% of properties being sold through the auction process. But as I said, it really depends on the property itself, the price, and the location you're buying.
Yeah. I think for property investors, whilst it might not be the most popular method of sale for the properties that they're purchasing, as you say, you know, the top end of town, it looks great, right? If this is a $10 million place, the agents want to have this buzz and this energy, and they want to film it and show that they're, you know, active in that space. But I think it's important for property investors to be prepared that the property that might be ticking all of their boxes could go to auction. So I suppose that's the focus of what we want to talk about today. The auction, I suppose, can be broken up into a few different phases. There's, you know, the pre-auction where you've got to do your analysis and your due diligence and do all the little dancy stuff with the agent. We've got the auction itself, the actual day, and then there's quite a lot that happens afterwards. Starting with the beginning, if this property is ticking our boxes and the comparables that we've looked at seem to be matching the agent guide, that's a whole episode in itself. If we think that this is something that could land within our sort of scope of what we want to pay, what are the first steps? What should a property investor be doing?
The very first thing that they should be doing, let's say after they've walked through the property and they feel like it starts to make sense, is do some high level due diligence. So knowing that you're going to be looking at this from a wealth creation perspective, you don't want to buy a property that has a lot of hairs on it. So check your flood zones, check your proximity to public housing, check fire zones, check anything that might concern you or steer you away from the property. So
Yep.
once you've done that, assuming the property still looks good on paper, it's time to start doing your comparative market assessments. Try and work out from your perspective what the property's worth, rather than leaning into what the real estate agent is saying. It's always good to keep in the back of your mind that the agent does have an incentive to steer you towards a higher price because they're working and they're being paid by the seller. So once you've got those two things in place, the third thing you should really think about before you rock up on auction day is, what is going to be my walkaway price? And a great way to frame this would be, if the property sold for $1 more, usually it's $1,000 more, I'd be completely content that that property wasn't for me.
Yep.
And a way to frame that in your head as well is to say, well, let's say that does pan out on auction day and the property sold for $1,000 more than our top limit. It's worth knowing that you never know if that was actually the other buyer's limit as well. So if you then went another $5,000, they could have spent $6. If you spent another 10, they could have spent 11. So if you had a continued bidding on that property, it might have sold for $30,000 more. So it's never just that $1,000 that made you miss out on a property. But really, really critical. Make sure you set that top line budget. And then in the back of that is, make sure you go in with a bit of a strategy. Don't just rock up on auction day and wait for someone else to make the first move.
Before we talk about that day, that's game day, right? That's the big event. I know it's different from state to state, but typically, what would happen if this is a property that you know that you're wanting to be there at the auction, you're wanting to bid on, you're needing to register your details with the real estate agent, or should you just be saying that I'm going to be there? What sort of questions will they ask you? You know, I'm presuming they'll say, you know, what sort of budget have you got? I'm sure you're going to be giving a cautionary tale on being too open with the agent, but you kind of want them to see that you're a prospect, right? And take you seriously.
Yeah, for sure, because you don't want to miss out on being privy to important information. A great example would be that property doesn't, just because it's listed for sale at auction, doesn't mean it has to sell on auction day. It could sell beforehand. So if you're holding all your cards too close to your chest when it comes to the real estate agent, they may completely forget about you, and they've got another buyer who's really, really keen, and suddenly the property sells before auction, and you've lost out. So it's great that you asked that, Mike. So once you've done your checks and you've got a bit of an idea as to what the property's worth, it's time to turn your attention to the real estate agent. And usually when we're preparing for auction, it's probably that process starts within, say, the 10 or 7 days leading up to auction. So you're always keeping in touch with the agent, saying, "Yep, I'm interested. Keep me in the loop. Just make sure you come back to me if there's any other buyers, that want to buy beforehand." But in that 7 days leading up, you start wanting to kind of get an idea as to what the competition will be on game day. So you're often trying to chat with the agent, get the inside scoop on whether there's other buyers that are interested, whether there's other buyers that are going to register for the auction, which I'd imagine is going to be your next question. And then feeling out what the strength of the other buyers, the competition will be on auction day, because that's going to really set the basis for the strategy you set for how you're going to actually bid on the day.
Yeah, and I almost forgot to even think about the fact that it could actually sell before auction day. And I'm guessing that is a strategy for a buyer's agent if they believe that it's not in their interest to have it go to auction, right? They would like to wrap it up beforehand. Is that a strategy that you would employ?
Absolutely, but not all the time. So it's a really key point to flag here that every property's negotiation strategy will be different, and it's always focused on the circumstances relating to the seller, the real estate agent, and the buyers, as to whether or not it makes sense to buy the property beforehand. So, if we were talking, we're recording now in early 2023, if we were talking late 2021, when the market was going absolutely bananas, there was actually a lot of merit to purchasing a property before auction, because at that time, auctions were almost guaranteed to be a surprise. The result was always going to be a surprise to the buyers and also the sellers.
Yep.
So if you could play that game and purchase the property for prior for a price that appeared to be a surprise to the sellers,
yep,
but had the absolute confidence that if that property went to auction, say 2 weeks or 7 days after you purchased it, that it was going to sell for more, then that would be a time that you'd buy prior. But in a market that there isn't a significant amount of buyer activity, it really begs the question: is it the smartest approach to try and buy the property before auction? Because if you think about the seller's perspective, the only reason they would sell before auction would be if it's a great price.
Yep. Yeah. So I guess you in a rapidly accelerating market, you might say to the owner, we'll give you 50 grand over where you think their head might be at, which could be 3 weeks ago, or it could be, 2 months ago, but that the momentum is building and there's a chance that someone could pay $100,000 over comparables because they've missed out or they want to get it, or they have a stronger belief in the direction of the market. So you would be surprising the vendor on the upside, but removing the potential surprise that there's actually more money for them at the auction.
Absolutely. And in fact, there was circumstances where we had clients in a position to purchase and were willing to make an offer that, because of the relationships you generate with real estate agents, being in a buyer's agent's role, we can sometimes get a lot of confidence about what kind of offer the vendors would accept without actually physically making that offer.
Yep.
So we had circumstances where the vendors were willing to accept a price 2 weeks before an auction. We didn't commit to that price, but then the auction then went and sold for, as you said, 5, 7, 8% beyond those expectations 2 weeks prior. So it's always a game of chess and reading the field through the information you can generate from the seller and the real estate agent.
Yep. So we know this hypothetical property, whatever it is, that we want it, and the agent has said, it's going to auction. It's happening on Saturday. We've got a few people that are interested. What's the next situation there? You're registering and trying to get as much intel as you can to prepare for game day?
Absolutely. So as I said before, keeping in contact with the real estate agent and trying to dive into the motivations. In our business, we call it's all of a motivations approach. So what's driving the seller and what's driving the real estate agent to agree to the offer that's presented or the price that's presented. So we're trying to work that out. And a good part of that approach is reading the competition, because on auction day, which we'll get to in a second, you're no longer negotiating with the seller.
Yes.
You're actually negotiating with the other buyers on the auction room floor. So we'll come to that. But in terms of the administrative side, yes, in New South Wales, as is my experience, there's a few forms that need to be filled out. And when we register on behalf of our clients, we need to fill out another form called an authority to bid form, which allows them to authorize us to make bids on their behalf. But if you're doing it yourself, you do need to register, show your interest, and that can usually happen in the lead up. So some real estate agents might want to do that 2, 3, 4 days in advance of the auction.
Yep.
But some agents would prefer to do that on the day. So they just say, look, show up half an hour before the auction and we'll get all your paperwork sorted on the day.
Yep. And prior to the day, they'll issue a copy of the contract, which you can get your solicitor conveyancer to look at, right? The pest and building. We've done all that sort of due diligence stuff. It's auction day morning. How do we sort of calm the nerves and come up with a little bit of a strategy? And I'm guessing the answer to that depends on the intel that you've gathered on how many people you're expected to be there, what sort of the heat is in that property, how open you think the agent has been with you, and perhaps even who the auctioneer to be, right? Because in your game, there's probably a few names that do the circuit, and that they all negotiate in different ways. So how do we negotiate all that after the coffee's just worn off and we're lacing up our boots ready for the auction? The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Well, I'll answer the start of your question first. So how would you kind of reduce the nerves and make sure that you can be nice and calm on auction day? It's very simple. Be prepared. And the way that we would prepare our clients is, as I said, set that top end budget before you walk in, before you walk through the property the last time, 10 minutes before the auction, and see something nice and exciting. And that will be based on all the research you've done.
Yep.
The second thing you'd like to do is play out the auction in your head and ensure that you understand your role in the auction. So what you're going to do when this happens, when that happens, so that nothing's a surprise on the day. And that can be really hard for someone who hasn't done it before. So you might want to go the weekend before and do the auction circuit. Watch a few auctions, watch what people did well, watch what they didn't do well, and try and pick the best parts of it. So you open the door from the car on auction day, and you've got the plan inside your head. The next thing that we would suggest you do is try and become comfortable with what will become a very, very public event. So often there's lots of people around watching, and that can really set your nerves on fire. So a good way that we approach this is we go and introduce ourselves to the agent and the auctioneer if we haven't met them before, and explain our role in the process, and be very overt with the agent. Yep. Because remember, everything is on show pretty much from the moment you step out of the car door. So you want to give the impression, and this is coming back to the strategy that we have for our buyers, is you give the impression that you're coming in to win this, and you might have an advantage that the other buyers don't. Now, whether or not you do have that advantage or not, the impression is really important because, which we'll get to in a second, when we start holding up the bidding card and it all starts happening, we want the only way for us to save money on the auction room floor is to convince the other buyers that are making bids to stop bidding before their limit.
Yep. And
the way we can do that is, it sounds terrible, but we want to essentially intimidate those buyers to giving up before they get to their limit. Basically saying, this buyer's agent buyer over here has the deepest pockets in the world and he will not stop. Therefore, I'm not going to keep fighting.
That's really interesting. I suppose that's part of the buyer's agent tradecraft. I mean, you're there as an industry insider in a way. I presume you'll be dressed a bit like the agent will be, which will make you stand out. How far do you push that? I mean, because often you go to an auction, you see somebody pull up in, a fancy car, and you're like, oh, okay, they're going to get it, right? Is that sort of what you want to do, is to make it feel like it's a foregone conclusion, and then they just sort of, despairingly walk away and look at the next one, right? Because it is a bit sad for the other buyers, but you're here because you want the property and you don't want to pay a premium for it, right? They're going to be okay.
That's right. Although for me personally, that would involve me having a fancy car in the first place.
Yeah.
It's
not necessary, you're saying.
Yeah, look, it really comes down to personal preference. That can be a strategy that you might want to employ. For us, it's more so about creating the air of confidence and relationship with the selling agent and the auctioneer. Of course, they're working for the seller. There's no doubt about that. But if we can create this illusion that buddy, they must be best friends, it's not what the real estate agents typically want.
Yep.
But it can be a part of those seeds of doubt that might set in for other buyers when they're bidding. Sorry.
Yep. And there's a lot of sort of commentary around whether you should bid first or just wait until the end and sort of sneak in as that wild card. Like, where do you land on that sort of strategy? Like, is that just kind of a little bit silly playing those games and you should just get involved, or should there be games that you're playing?
Good question. And it comes back to the strategy that you'd like to set. So if we know that the only way to save money on the property is to stop other buyers bidding before their limit,
yep,
then it begs the question, how would you be able to do that by being that person that lurks in the background and
yep,
that is just that final bid? Because if that's the case, then what you're doing is you're waiting for everyone else to get to their limits, and then you're just adding $1,000 on the top, essentially. So our approach is essentially the opposite. We want to be the most confident and focal point of the auction. In fact, it's a win for us if people remember us more than they remember the auctioneer.
Yep.
Now, the auctioneer does a significant amount of talking in the lead up and tries to control the auction. Yep. But if it's in our best interest to actually completely change that balance. So what we often do is we don't want to stand immediately across from the auctioneer. We tend to want to stand a little bit almost beside the auctioneer, like not holding hands, but to the side of the auction, so that when you make a bid, the auctioneer has to turn to you, and almost all of the other buyers are also looking at you.
Yep.
Now, what that'll do is that'll put a face to the bid. You're then, showing an air of confidence. You're potentially dressed very differently to the rest of the competition. And to answer your question, it's in our client's best interest for us to lead the auction, i.e., make the first bid, because that sets the foundation for that confidence right through the auction.
Yep. And what sort of tricks can we expect from the auctioneer as it's going along? What are some of the typical go-tos that you see that try and sort of either unseat people like you, or they try and sort of get people to bid emotionally, or get to the point where, mum and dad might be there and they're tapping them on the shoulder saying, well, chuck in another 10, like, let's get this done?
I've got a great example, actually, and you'll probably be gobsmacked, but there's the real estate an auctioneer who had a perfect auction. It was a very high-end property in Newcastle, just sold for just under 4 million. But the auction, when the auctioneer starts an auction, they've got the most incentive to have the bids as wide as possible. So what an auctioneer might tend to do is say, look, I'm starting the auction here, but I'm only accepting $50,000 increments.
Yep.
And that's them usually giving a sign, at least it's to us, it gives them a sign as to how far away they are from the seller's reserve price.
Yep.
But realistically, the buyer can change that. The buyer can tell the agent or the auctioneer what offer they'd like to make. So this particular example is a property that started out with $50,000 increments. Yep. And the final bid was a $50,000 increment over the second last bid. So it begs the question. Why did that person have to pay an extra $49,000 to buy that property? Yeah. Why, when he could have done it with one?
Yeah. And I mean, maybe one wouldn't have got it done, but could it have been a 5 or a 10 or a 25?
That's right.
Like there was money to be saved. And I suppose you were kind of thinking, that's the sort of person that maybe said, oh, Matt, your fee to bid at auction is a bit high. Like, can we talk about that? But then you could have saved them 40 grand then and there.
Absolutely. And look, now that we're talking about auction bids themselves, generally the increments that an auctioneer is trying to guide the auction in, so whether it's 50,000s, 20,000s, 10s, the auctioneer does have the authority, at least in perception, to deny a bid.
Yep.
But when it comes down to it, when that is the only voice that's heard on the auction room floor, an auctioneer will come back to you and lower their acceptance for a bid.
Yep.
So try and avoid, at least at the very tail end of an auction, try and avoid falling in line with what the auctioneer is asking you to do.
Yep.
And stand firm. You know, if you can see that the other buyers have reduced their bid amounts, which again for us it's a sign that the other buyers are tapping out, then don't if the other buyers have made a $1,000 or a $5,000 bid, don't allow the auctioneer to convince you to make $10,000 on your following bid. Just mirror what we do for our clients is we actually mirror the other buyers. So I'm kind of jumping around here, Mike, but a sign for us would be, as I said, what increments the auction bidding is going in. Yep. And we never want to be that first person to reduce the amount that we're bidding. We want the other buyers to do that because that's a sign. So let's say we're at tens, they're making an offer at a bid at 610. We'll just mirror that with 620. If they go to 630, we'll go to 640. If they then go to 645, then we're not going to go to 655. We're going to go to 650.
Yep.
Then if they go to 651, we're at 652. Yep. And the strategy there would be to avoid paying more than you have to, but also not sending a signal to the other buyers that, hey, we're getting close to our limit as well.
Yeah, I guess you're just running beside them, right? And if they slow down, you slow down, and they don't know if you're a faster runner or not, right? You're just sticking there with them. I like that. That's yeah, it's very cheeky. All right, so let's say we've gone through the process. This is a property that's still, in the price range of what we want, but there's a reserve that's a little bit higher than expected, but we still think that there's an opportunity for a deal to be done and this property is passed in. How does it work if you are, say, the highest bidder versus the second highest bidder? What rights does the highest bidder have when that auction is passed in?
It's a great question, and just to explain that a bit further, a property would pass in where the sellers had agreed that they would sell the property at 700, let's say, before the auction, and the highest bid only got to say 670. Yep. The highest bidder actually gets what they call the first right of reply. Yep. So while the auction is still running, the sellers can, through their agent, can negotiate directly with the highest bidder. And the highest bidder might, theoretically in this example, come up to 685, yep. And the sellers have come down from 700 to 685. They agree on a price. The highest bidder then outbids themselves. They move their bid from 670 to 685. The hammer drops and the property is sold. Yep. Now, that's not technically a property that's passed in. A property would pass in where the buyer and the seller don't get to an agreement on the day.
Right.
And what happens after that is the buyer still gets that option, that first right of reply to negotiate with the seller, but realistically, the property can be negotiated by any other party as well. Yep. So there is a little bit of a risk for your buyers that allow a property to pass in that another buyer could come in. The reality is that most of the time, all of the people that are interested in the property have actually registered for the auction. So it's not often that a property would sell to another party on the Monday after a Saturday auction than the highest bidder on the day.
Yeah. Okay. So that puts you in the box seat.
That's right. Yep.
All right. Time flies when you're having fun. Finish us off, Matt, if you can. What are your big tips? What are your top 2 or 3 tips for getting prepared? Let's say if you're not working with a buyer's agent, because obviously this is a service that you do and you can take all the stress away from people. But if you're hell-bent on doing that yourself, what are the 3 most important things?
First one I would say is know your top limit. And the way to do that would be to research recent comparable sales. So know what you're going to walk away at. That's number 1. Number 2 would be to play out the auction in your head and come up with a strategy so that when the auctioneer asks you for an opening bid, you know what you're going to do. And then the third thing would be to never show any kind of emotion through your body language. So even if you've only got $1,000 left between where your highest bid is now and where your top limit is, you never want that to be shown on the auction room floor. There's been multiple occasions where we've literally won the auction with less than $3,000 worth towards our limit. But we won that auction because we convinced the other buyers to stop throwing their hat in the ring. So those would be my top three.
That's beautiful. They thought he's got another 50 to go, and you're silently internally panicking, but on the outside, this is a done deal. I love that, Matt. Thank you very much for sharing all of those tips and that gold today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Mike. Appreciate it.
Cheers.